This is the start of Unit 6. This is our second unit about American women in this class. So we'll be picking up essentially from where we left off, sort of. The first unit stops with suffrage, and we're going to be sort of getting into other progressive things women were doing around the same time as suffrage, and then we'll pick up from after women got the right to vote, and we'll go all the way up to essentially the present. We'll get all the way to the 1990s, and then and the fourth wave of feminism, and then present day things going on. We'll talk about those in the last unit, which is mostly current events. So starting off this unit, like I said, I want to talk about other things that women were doing during the progressive era besides working for the right to vote. During this time, we're talking about Gilded Age, the early 20th century. We're seeing a huge wave of immigrants coming into the United States. Mostly, these are our new immigrants, right? So we're seeing like mostly Eastern European and Southern European, very poor, don't speak a lot of English. These are people that definitely need help, especially women and children. So Jane Addams, which is the lady that you see on the slide on the right, Addams with two D's. She took it upon herself to found a institution dedicated to helping those immigrants, and it was called Hull House, Hull House, out of Chicago. And they taught they had like social, educational, artistic programs. It almost was like a community center slash shelter for immigrants moving into Chicago. All of her volunteers would work as nurses. If you were sick, they offered childcare. They were a shelter for abused women, and nothing like that really existed at the time. They advocated for reform in a lot of other areas. They had like a rec center, a playground. They taught classes. You could take English classes there, art classes, all sorts of stuff. And in 1930, all of Jane's efforts will earn her the right to call herself the first woman to ever earn the Nobel Peace Prize, which is pretty incredible. Now, on top of our immigrants needing help, we know this is a time of industrial reform, a lot of industrial reform going on, and child labor was a big piece of that. Children working in factories had a lot of negative consequences, short-term and long-term. Children working in factories have slower rates of growth, both mentally and physically, stunted growth, poor vision and hearing from loud machines, not to mention it's extremely dangerous, a lot of these jobs. So a major piece of all of this is going to be stopping child labor. So a woman by the name of Florence Kelley, she was also in Illinois working out of Chicago, worked to found the U.S. Children's Bureau. And that was designed to, it was really the first institution made to look into how women and children were being affected in the United States by a variety of things, but especially by child labor in industry. And the first president of that group is a woman named Julia Lathrop, Lathrop, Julia Lathrop. And she was, so like I said, the first director of the U.S. Children's Bureau. And they used government funds to investigate child labor, the infant mortality rate, the maternal mortality rate, juvenile delinquency. I will say the one caveat to all of that, which was good, was that they were pretty much just looking into how it affected immigrants, which means white families. There were huge problems facing African American children in the South and other areas, but that was never a focus of the U.S. Children's Bureau. So that was definitely a big sort of hole in the system that I'm sure you can imagine why it existed. Just blatant racism, caring about white immigrant children more than Black American children. Unfortunately, I would say they were successful and also unsuccessful at the same time. They were able to get the U.S. government to pass the Keating-Owens Act, which banned child labor, but later, maybe like 2 or 3 years later, the federal government under the Supreme Court declared the Keating-Owens Act unconstitutional. So we won't officially ban child labor until the New Deal is put into place once we get into the Great Depression in the 1930s. Now, other industrial reform, we know that this is the age of major business tycoons like J.D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, who are all using tons of sketchy tactics at the expense of their employers and their consumers to make obscene amounts of money. Definitely earning that title of robber baron, a lot of them. And J.D. Rockefeller is sort of like the best example of that. He had the biggest reputation for being that robber baron type. And plenty of people tried to look into his, tactics and strategies and stuff, but without hardcore evidence, there's really not much to say other than he's rich and we're not, and it sucks. So a woman by the name of Ida Tarbell, his company had basically gone under because of J.D. Rockefeller's crazy business strategies. She was a writer, a journalist, and she took it upon herself to investigate J.D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company and find out everything she could. She was able to connect with actually one of Rockefeller's top executives, and sort of by flirting with him and making him think that they were a thing when they really weren't. She was on a fake date, "Ooh, tell me what you know." And he's like, "Oh, here are documents and here's all this information. You're so beautiful." Just trying to get with her. And she was just like, "Oh, that's wonderful. I'll take all these documents and never see you again." And she would do this not only to this guy, but several guys. She sort of used her feminine wilds to get any information she could. What an icon. And in 1904, she put it all together in a series of articles called The History of Standard Oil. And this caused such a ruckus. People were looking at actual documents, letters from inside the Standard Oil Company, letters from Rockefeller himself, exposing all of his shady business practices. And it stirred up such a mess that the U.S. government actually had no choice. They decided to use the Sherman Antitrust Act and other trust busting laws and forced J.D. Rockefeller to split his company. They said that it was a monopoly and a bad one at that. So they decided to divide his company into two oil companies, and they remained two oil companies up to this day. Two of our largest gas companies in the world are actually what was originally Standard Oil. Now, along with all of this industry and everything going on, what else is happening in the world? But one big thing facing Americans in the late 19 teens would be the Spanish influenza. This was a global pandemic. 500 million people across the planet were they contracted the Spanish influenza from 1918 to 1920. This whole thing lasted for 2 years, and close to 100 million people were killed. Some of this was during World War I, and we were seeing higher death rates from the influenza than we were seeing from the actual war. Life expectancy in the United States dropped 12 years. And while this was a very tragic situation, it actually, surprisingly, silver lining, had some positive effects for women in medicine. A lot of male doctors were failing at treating patients, being very negative about all of the patients that they had lost. And this gave female nurses the opportunity to celebrate their own successes. And we'll start to see the first women in medicine really starting to make headway here. More female nurses, the start of female doctors. And this is going to be an important moment as women start to get into more of these scientific fields. But aside from women's suffrage, definitely the biggest, I guess you could say, progressive agenda that we're going to see happening for women is going to be birth control. I know when I say birth control, you think of the birth control pill. Oral contraceptive. Contraceptive means birth control. The oral contraceptive will not exist until 1961. So there's no science to have a birth control pill at this point. So that's not the type of birth control I'm talking about. There were plenty of forms of birth control before the oral contraceptive ever existed. Early forms of birth control, condoms, prolonged breastfeeding, there's a ton of different things. But in 1873, there was this social purity movement going on. And they saw birth control as something that promoted prostitution and STDs. So, in a guy named Anthony Comstock, that's what he looked like down there at the bottom of that political cartoon with a massive mustache. He was the postal inspector, and he convinced not only his home state, but eventually the federal government to pass a law called the Comstock Law, which basically said that you can't publish information about birth control or STDs. You can't publish anything or send in the mail anything designed to prevent contraceptive because it was considered obscene. This was one in a series of laws called obscenity laws. This was like a very, I guess you would say conservative time period, and publishing information about birth control and sex and anything like that was considered extremely obscene. So they literally banned it. Now, that is going to not sit well with the free speech movement people, which was also happening at this time. Most of the free speech movement was targeting like free speech about politics, but this definitely counts. This is definitely a violation of free speech. And this woman that you see over here on the left, her name was Margaret Sanger, Sanger, Margaret Sanger, and she was a nurse. And growing up, her mother had been through 18 pregnancies in 22 years. And I know a lot of us don't maybe know a lot about the effects that a pregnancy or childbirth can have on a woman's body, but there are a lot of dangers to being pregnant and having children. Her mother actually ended up getting cervical cancer because of all of her pregnancies, and died at 50 because of that. And that's just one of many things that can happen when your body goes through that many traumatic experiences. Because remember, we're also living in a society that's saying that women need to serve their husbands at all costs. There's no such thing as saying no, you don't want to have sex with your husband. And at this time, marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. If a man wanted to have sex with his wife, she's considered his property, and he's allowed to do with her whatever he wants, regardless of the consequences. So there was really no way other than birth control for women to prevent themselves from becoming pregnant. And Margaret, growing up, seeing what her mother went through, on top of that, she was working in New York on the Lower East Side with a lot of immigrants, and she worked with a lot of immigrant patients who suffered tons of negative effects from childbirth and plenty of botched abortions. Because remember, if you're a woman, let's say you're a poor immigrant woman, you get pregnant, maybe you already know the negative effects that this could have on your body and you're terrified. Or let's say that you're so poor and you know that your family cannot financially support another child. You have no option to get an abortion. There's no right to choice at this time, and we won't see that until the 1970s. So of course there were doctors, or I guess I should say quote doctors, who would perform abortions, but they were often very unsafe, and women would die, hemorrhage out, bleed out, at worst. At best, they could lose their ability to have children ever. So wealthy women who see a doctor on a regular basis, they're not banning birth control. They're just banning the production of information about birth control. So wealthy women, you can just go to your doctor and you can say, like, I want to be put on birth control. Like, what are my options? And they'd say, like, oh, we got condoms, we got IEDs, we got all these things. And that's great for them. But poor women and immigrant women remember, we have no, like, real insurance or healthcare system at this point in time. they don't have a doctor that they can go to. And there's no such thing as a free clinic at this point in time. So they can't even read information about birth control. Even if they could read it, they can't order it because all that stuff is banned because of the Comstock Law. They can't, mail anything like that. So Margaret Sanger takes up this torch and it's like, I'm going to get women access to birth control if it kills me. So she starts publishing a magazine called The Woman Rebel. And the slogan of it was no gods, no masters. And it was like women should be in control of their own body. And she literally came up with the term birth control. She was the first person to use that phrasing. And it about got her arrested, right? Because obviously publishing a magazine about birth control, especially one saying no gods, no masters, women should be the the governor of their own body. That's obviously against the Comstock Law. So she was about to get arrested, so she decided to flee to Europe. And her husband was like, Margs, I ain't gonna let you down. I'm gonna keep publishing it for you. So he kept publishing these copies of The Woman Rebel, and obviously that meant he got arrested. So while she was in Europe and her husband was in jail, a woman named Mary Dennett, Dennet, she formed the National Birth Control League, and they began lobbying Congress for a federal law to legalize birth control in the United States. Eventually, Sanger came back from Europe and was like, screw it, I'm just going to have to risk getting arrested because women need my help. While she was in Europe, actually, she began meeting doctors who were working on the first versions of oral contraceptives. And she started smuggling in from Europe new forms of birth control, diaphragms, IUDs, all of these things. So when she came back from Europe, she formed a clinic, the Brownsville Clinic, out of Brooklyn. And an undercover policewoman went to that clinic and busted them for, producing information about birth control. And Sanger refused to be arrested. She refused to walk out with the cops, so they had to literally drag her out. And all of Margaret Sanger's friends and supporters formed this group called the Committee of 100, and they raised public funds for her to get her out of jail, to provide her support. And they started publishing their own magazine that she wrote for called the Birth Control Review. She did 90 days in jail and then she got out. Now, the thing that's finally going to turn the tide for this fight for birth control is actually going to be World War I, which I know sounds weird. But during World War I, our soldiers are going overseas. They're going to Europe. And they're doing, whatever they do. And they get 1 billion STDs, so many STDs. That was the number one thing soldiers were going to the doctor for. It wasn't, I got hurt in this battle. It was, I have an STD. So the U.S. government actually had to do a huge campaign to promote safe sex because so many of our soldiers were down for the count because of STDs. And so seeing the U.S. government produce all this information about sex really started to take the shock out of hearing about it for a lot of Americans. And that started to change people's minds. Maybe these obscenity laws are kind of dumb and not necessary. So finally, one of Margaret Sanger's doctors who worked at the Brownsville Clinic, her name was Dr. Hannah Stone. She had ordered a new type of diaphragm called a pessary, Pessary, from a Japanese doctor in Tokyo that had just invented them. So she ordered this because she wanted to see how it worked and maybe prescribe it to some of her patients. And since it went through the mail, that was a violation of the Comstock Law. So the U.S. government seized the package as it entered the United States under the Tariff Act, found that it was, birth control related, and arrested Dr. Hannah Stone, and charged, the company and the Brownsville Clinic for violating the Comstock Law. And this made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the case was U.S. v. One Package. And ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that doctors can mail whatever they want to married people. I want to be specific about that. So now married women have total access to birth control and birth control information. Single women will not have access to birth control until 1972. It'll take a new Supreme Court case. And that, I mean, think about 1972. Think about how many of your parents were alive by 1972. Single women did not have the right to birth control until 1972. Even during that time period between the U.S. v. One Package case and 1972, when married women had access to it, many doctors would still require a woman's husband's permission to put her on birth control. Insane. But after her major win, Margaret Sanger continued to focus on fighting for birth control for women. She continued to grow her Brownsville clinic, and it would one day become Planned Parenthood.